Big Buck Registry's Big Buck Podcast, episode number 41, Inside Boone and Crocket. Big Buck Registry is a virtual museum of hunting stories. We preserve a piece of Americana by interviewing and recording hunters about their hunts and experiences from across the country. And who knows, maybe we'll learn a thing or two along the way that'll help us take our hunt to the next level.
This is Milo Hansen, and you're listening to the Big Buck Registry, the Big Buck Podcast.
Welcome to the show, everybody. This is Jay Scott, your host of the Big Buck Registry's Big Buck Podcast. We're back again, and I've got on the other line my good friend and field correspondent from Ohio, Dusty Phillips. Dusty, what is going on?
Oh, not a whole lot. It's a beautiful day in the neighborhood. It won't be long and the old Thunder chickens will be moving.
Absolutely, man. And I'm going to be busting out my old Mossberg 500, my turkey killer. So
right on. What's going on tonight with the show?
All right. Have you ever heard of the Boone and Crocket Club?
Wow. Who hasn't?
That's what I said. I mean, this thing has been around for
1800, mid 1800s, know, it's been around for a long time. I'm not exact on the date, but I know that they've been around and I know that they've done a lot for the hunting industry.
They have been around since 1886, and it was actually started by Teddy Roosevelt, and who was a former president and big conservationist, and what was formerly known as Field and Stream, who, of course, you've heard of the magazine Field and Stream.
Oh, for sure. You know, it's, Are you we're saying we're going to talk with Boone and Crocket?
We are going to speak and learn all about Boone and Crocket today on today's show.
I'm done talking with you. Let's get on with the show.
All right, man. I have the Director of Marketing, Keith Balford, and I also have the Assistant Director of Big Game Records, Justin Spring, that have agreed to join us today. And let's get them on the phone right now.
Let's call them.
Justin and Keith, welcome to the Big Buck Registry's Big Buck Podcast.
Thank you, Jay. Thanks for having us on.
Well, thanks for joining us. It's not every day we get to talk to Boone and Crocket, and we think this is quite a pleasure to have you guys aboard. And we want to get into all about Boone and Crocket because I got to tell you, it's one name that I can remember back to when I was about 5 years old. And I think it's important that we get into what this club is truly all about and get the message out to our fan club and our listeners to really tell the story, if that's cool.
That's great. Looking forward to it.
Excellent. Tell us about you guys. Where are you guys at right now, and what seats do you hold with Boone and Crocket?
We're in the Missoula headquarters right now, and I'm the Assistant Director of Big Game Records, and Keith here is our Director of Marketing. We're both out of the Missoula office, so we are here in the frozen north right now.
All right. I've got 27 degrees, and I just shoveled 8 inches of partly cloudy. So how did you guys get involved with Boone and Crocket in the first place?
With me, I went to school for wildlife. I got a degree in wildlife management and was kind of just working around the West Coast with different wildlife agencies and whatnot, and a job came open here. It's kind of how I got into it. That was almost 6 years ago now when I started.
I've been here 12 years. I've had a background in marketing. Prior to this, I spent quite a bit of time helping companies in the outdoor industry with their marketing communications needs, and this position opened up with Boone and Crocket. They wanted to expand their ability to market and get their messaging out, and so we created a marketing department 12 years ago.
Really? Interesting. So Boone and Crocket didn't have a significant marketing department 12 years ago?
It didn't have one 50 years ago or 75 or 90 or 100 years ago.
Wow. Interesting.
Last year was the club's 125th anniversary, and we're not what you call your typical conservation organization that has local chapters and is accumulating a huge membership.
Right.
We're very much focused on the conservation work that we do. Obviously, the records and records keeping has been a big component of that. But it's been a very small organization for a very long time. This dates all the way back to Theodore Roosevelt when he founded the club.
That's cool.
Yeah. So
let's get into a little bit of that history. Walk us through how Boone and Crocket first got its name and existence into this industry.
Okay. Well, like I mentioned, the club was originally founded by Theodore Roosevelt and George Bird Grinnell. Roosevelt was a emerging politician in New York. George Bird Grinnell at the time was the editor of Field and Stream magazine, or excuse me, Forest and Stream, which is now Field and Stream.
Interesting.
And Roosevelt, fancied himself as an explorer, an outdoors person, loved to ride, loved to shoot, loved to hunt. He came out west in the late 1800s, specifically to hunt buffalo. And when he got here, this was in North Dakota at the time. And basically what he found, long story long, was nothing but acres of bleached bones. And this really disturbed him. He spent more time in the West hunting and realized that our thirst for exploration, opening up the West, manifest destiny as it was called, was draining our natural resources at an alarming rate. And he was determined to do something about that. So he returned back to New York City and invited 12 of his friends to a dinner party. This was December 8th, 1887.
Yeah.
And he sprang this idea on them to start a coalition of sportsmen that would address matters of big game conservation on a national scale. And these 12 men agreed. They decided to name the organization the Boone and Crocket Club after Daniel Boone and Davy Crockett, which were the hunter heroes of their era.
Sure. Fascinating. So this club, Boone and Crocket, which by the way has been a name that I can remember way back when I was a kid, and I never really knew what it meant back then, but it was always around. My grandfather talked about it, and his grandfather talked about it. And that was about the same start. So it seems like that whole message kind of traveled quickly across the United States, because I can remember my forefathers or my grandfather, his grandfather, talking about stuff regarding the Boone and Crocket. So this goes back to a former president of the United States forming this club because he wanted to form a way to protect our natural resources, specifically out west.
Correct. Most people, and rightfully so, through time have associated the name Boone and Crocket with a scoring system and a record book, and we can certainly talk about that. But the main thrust of the club, going all the way back to Roosevelt, was actually establishing the notion of conservation. In 1887, conservation wasn't even a word in the English language, and it was defined by George Bird Grinnell as wise and prudent use without waste.
Right.
And the very first thing that the Boone and Crocket Club did was save Yellowstone Park. That's something that most people have no idea of. There's not a sign or a placard there, but at that time, Yellowstone Park, our first national park, was being plundered by mining and timber interests, poaching. They were going to put a railroad right through the middle of it. And so the club got busy with some legislation that secured the park, expanded its boundaries, created law enforcement. And so that was the very first initiative of the club, and it just started rolling from there. Literally everything that we have today in this country related to conservation, believe it or not, was either initiated by Boone and Crocket, started by Boone and Crocket, promoted by Boone and Crocket, and this is a long list, but the National Park Service, the National Forest Service, the National Wildlife Refuge System were all Boone and Crocket initiatives. Roosevelt's vision was huge. He basically started with a blank piece of paper. There was no government agencies at the time. We didn't have biological survey. There wasn't a BLM. There wasn't even a science of wildlife management. We funded, education programs, developed careers in wildlife biology. We're responsible for establishing the funding mechanisms that we have for conservation, like the Pittman-Robertson Act,
right.
the Federal Duck Net Program. The list goes on and on. So, lots transpired in 125 years. And the good news, at least to me anyway, is sportsmen did all this. We're talking about hunters.
Right.
hunters established the National Wildlife Refuge system. I mean, that sounds like an irony, but that's factual. This is a great part of American history that is not well known by many people unless you're a career wildlife professional. You've studied this in your course materials and you know that history.
Right. I was going to ask you about the Pittman-Robertson Act. We interviewed a fellow out of Alabama who wrote an article about Pittman-Robertson and how the funds are given, basically taken from guns and ammunition sales and then redistributed to the conservation efforts in each state based off of the number of hunters and the amount of forest land that you have. And that was in 1937, I think, when that came in. So this predates the Pittman-Robertson Act completely.
Boone and Crocket, yeah, we started, like I said, in 1887, and, you know, a lot of legislation, a lot of conservation policy happened up until Pittman-Robertson. You know, the amazing thing about the Pittman-Robertson Act, 1937, we're in the heart of the Great Depression, and sportsmen elected to tax themselves. Huge commitment. You know, taxes are a four-letter word right now, but if you can imagine sportsmen stepping up or stepping out of a soup line and saying, you know what, I care enough about wildlife that I'm going to pay that extra, you know, few cents out of you know, every dollar to help wildlife and sustain these outdoor traditions that I love. That was a huge sacrifice that's gone greatly overlooked.
Right. Yeah. Especially back then, that was to be taxed on anything. And I guess, you know, pre-1937, it was, you talked about Teddy Roosevelt finding the bones on the prairies, and that kind of thing was happening more or less across the country, not just out west, where I think there were about 2,000 deer left in Alabama in 1937 when this act went into play. So it was a necessary thing to do back then. And without Boone and Crocket, without Pittman-Robertson, we would not have wildlife as we know it today.
No, that's true. And you know, there's a great misconception here that you know, the loss of all this wildlife, the near extinction of the bison, the extinction of the passenger pigeon, the loss of the Audubon sheep and the Merriam's elk, and, you know, the complete drain down of the wild turkey and whitetail deer and all that stuff was a bunch of irresponsible hunters running around shooting everything. And a lot of people forget that at that time, commercial market hunting was a business. It was a career for a lot of people that didn't have jobs. We didn't have the, you know, instituted cattle ranching industry that we have today. I mean, this is how we fed a growing nation. And we talk about legislation. Senator John F. Lacey of Iowa was a Boone and Crocket member. He passed the Lacey Act, which pretty much dropped the hammer on market hunting. That was something that had to go.
Right.
You know, even my young daughter, she's, you know, in elementary school is being taught that, well, we used to have all these buffalo, but hunters shot them all. And that's grossly wrong. And, so anyway, yeah, something definitely had to be done. And it's, you know, without a doubt, what we've been able to accomplish with our wildlife is one of the great reversals of fortune in world history.
Fascinating. Yeah, I think it's important to share this message. It's, do you agree that this message should be, brought to the forefront a little more often than it is, that, these institutions were created solely, for these purposes? And I think we kind of forget how we got here sometimes. Like that message needs to be shared over and over to remind us about the natural resources that we partake in every day when we step into the field with a firearm or bow and go hunting, that it didn't just happen. I mean, these resources were depleted at one time, and that, sometimes I think that message gets missed in handing down, the idea of hunting to, future hunters.
No, you're right, and not only among sportsmen, you know, that do hunt now. You know, a lot of them don't know this history or don't know this legacy that's been handed down to them. But certainly the folks out there that don't hunt, you know, we live in a democratic society, and majority votes win. And we've got a lot of folks out there now believing that the best way to manage wildlife is just to leave them alone, and natural systems will thrive on their own. And that's a dangerous line of thinking, and quite frankly, too narrow of a view. We don't live in a time vacuum. We can't just simply remove man from the equation. We live here. We work on the landscape. We've got to figure out ways to, still get our energy, still get our crops, yet still accommodate wildlife. And this preservationist attitude that's emerging out there, the hands-off, non-use, is really flawed.
Right.
And the more people that understand, I mean, it's hard. I'll admit that, but for folks that don't hunt to understand how sportsmen that care deeply about wildlife and are passionate about wildlife could actually kill wildlife. That's a hard thing for people to connect. But fact of the matter is, this sustainable use model that we have in this country, call it sustainable use, call it user-paid public benefit, it's got a lot of different names, is what has recovered the wildlife and is the reason why we have abundant wildlife and we still have wild places and wild things.
Right.
It's not so in other countries that don't operate this system. Wildlife there is scarce, poorly managed, if at all. The public really doesn't have easy access to it, and therefore it's being poached. There's a lot of things going on in Africa right now that would make your head swim in terms of natural resource conservation protection. That's just not happening over there unless there's hunting. Hunting brings that need for conservation to the forefront. So you're absolutely right. More people should study the history, especially those folks that are against hunting. They need to honestly ask themselves, where would the wildlife they cherish be if it wasn't for sportsmen?
Right. Yep. And it brings on more wildlife through regulated hunting, just unregulated hunting, chaotic hunting. That isn't really going to work. But the regulated hunting, that's where we're getting into conservation efforts.
Yeah, we did away with that. That's basically what the Lacey Act did away with. And sportsmen themselves, we established our game laws. We established bag limits. We established structured hunting seasons. These weren't federally mandated. Sportsmen stepped up and said, we don't need to hunt 24/7, 365.
Right.
And there needs to be, reasonable bag limits. We want to be able to have game in the field next year and the year after that.
Exactly. So the very rules that we have to live by as sportsmen, were created by sportsmen. It wasn't that the government came in and said, all right, that's it. You guys are set to these limits and that's the way it's going to be. All these things go back to sportsmen themselves. And I think that's the key to understanding this. And it's the part that kind of gets me agitated significantly when I hear an anti-hunter say that we kill just for the fun of it. It's part of our tradition. But what they fail to realize is that there's a great deal of conservation that goes along with it. And these days, because of my knowledge of the Lacey Act and the Pittman-Robertson Act and what we're learning tonight with Boone and Crocket, it just fuels that fire that, they're wrong and where it's okay to hunt, basically.
Yep, that's true. And, you just hit on a great point here is, sportsmen were responsible for a lot of this. This was a ground-up approach. Sportsmen that were the ones that were on the ground, having to venture further out to find their game. They're the ones that were coming across all the bleached bison bones. They're the ones that were, feeling the brunt of, unbridled exploitation, and not only the wildlife, but, irresponsible land use practices. We were draining wetlands, clear cutting, killing prairies. The habitat that this wildlife needed was equally being abused, and sportsmen were behind, those changes as well.
Right. Absolutely. Let's move on to some rules behind Boone and Crocket. We've established that Boone and Crocket had significant, influence on game management and conservation efforts in the United States. with that came rules as the Boone and Crocket Club. Tell us more about the club itself. What does it mean to be part of the club these days?
Well, the way we're built, and again, this goes back to Roosevelt, is by charter we have 100 what we call regular members. That's the voting body. That's the officers of the club. They're the guys that financially contribute to the club at a very high level. And then getting back to Roosevelt, he wanted to keep the club small and nimble from an organizational standpoint, but he realized that in order to do this tremendous amount of work, he needed professionals. And so we have another level of membership, which is called professional member. And these are your career biologists, educators, communicators, politicians, industrialists that may not financially contribute as much as the regular members to the club, but through their careers and their expertise, help, generate ideas, vision, that sort of thing. And then we also have an associate program where anybody who believes in the ideals of conservation, fair chase, as a fan of Theodore Roosevelt and anything that he started or belonged to, can join the organization. It's kind of our grassroots level. That's your $35 a year membership, and that's kind of the numbers structure. And then within that, the club has we're kind of a committee type organization.
Okay.
Where we have committees dedicated to various areas. We have a conservation policy committee, a wildlife health committee, a records committee, obviously, that Justin's involved with, outreach, communications, publications, and a lot of our club officers sit on these committees and they volunteer their time. There's a staff here in Missoula of 14 of us. The rest are all volunteers.
No
That's
kidding.
Amazing.
Wow. No kidding. So for $35, I could join the Boone and Crocket Club.
Correct.
And what does that get me?
Well, we publish a quarterly magazine, aptly named Fair Chase. That's our membership magazine. So you receive that. There's some other, bennies and perks, decals, hats, that type of thing. You have access to the online associate community on our website, discount on our merchandise and our books, and you really get access to a lot of these things that we just talked about, but also, that was more of a historical perspective, but all the things that the club is working on currently in the areas of hunting advocacy, conservation policy. The club really is we're always pointed at the horizon, so to speak. We're very concerned about what's coming, and that goes all the way back to Roosevelt. He was thinking years and years out, and what needs to be in place to get in front of some of the challenges that he felt was going to be emerging. And so we spent a lot of time looking at the future and trying to decide how can we sidestep some landmines, how can we build the infrastructure to take on some of the challenges that are going to come up. Energy development. We all agree that we should be striving for energy independence, but if not done right, that's going to come at a cost to the environment and wildlife. So let's be thinking about that.
Right.
A lot of talk about climate change. We're looking at that from the standpoint, how is that affecting wildlife and habitat? Wildlife health, I mentioned that as a committee. We've got CWD and EHD and blue tongue and some of these other things that weren't as widespread as they are today. What can be done about that? So, the club really believes that our wildlife needs all the advocates they can get, and we need informed sportsmen to carry these messages forward, know the issues, know what the problems are, know what the correct solutions are. So you ask what does an associate get? They're going to get pretty good dose of all that type of thing. And so that's pretty unique, we think anyway, in the associates that we have. You can really see them respond to that knowledge and that perspective. Because a lot of sportsmen, they see things, in their hometown that they don't understand or is changing right before their eyes and want to do something about it. The club is a great reservoir of information historically and today about just how to deal with these changes and what's doing right by wildlife, what's doing right by the environment.
Right. Gotcha. Now, the rules that apply to Boone and Crocket, and I hear things about what is allowed to be scored on the Boone and Crocket scoring system, and that there are other rules that apply to the fair chase. Can you elaborate a little bit on, like, for example, if there's a big rack whitetail that gets shot somewhere in the United States, and you want it to be part of the Boone and Crocket Club, what rules apply to that?
So to hit on that, the records program ties in with everything about the conservation that Keith just hit on. And, it was actually started, it was a, display in the Bronx Museum dedicated to the vanishing big game of the world. I mean, they literally thought these big game animals were going to be gone. And so that's when we kind of got our interest in records and recording the best of the best species. Well, as wildlife management started to take off, they saw that there was, areas that still needed help. But they also wanted to scientifically record the specimens, the best of the best, say what we had. And so what they did is they said, well, we want a record system of, what's the best, and we'll use that to gauge wildlife management. The idea being, if you're producing mature trophy males, everything else has to be in place to get to that point. So when they did that, they also said, we want to encourage fair chase hunting. This idea of trophy hunting, that developed at a time when there wasn't a surplus of deer. You didn't drive down, most major cities and have to watch out for deer crossing the road. There wasn't a lot out there. So this idea of taking a mature male past breeding age, this pursuit of a trophy, this high-end thing, it was a conservation tool. I mean, they weren't doing it to be selfish. It wasn't an ego booster. It was how can we hunt? How can we engage in nature? How can we continue to hunt and help the populations? So that was this whole idea of a pursuit of a trophy under fair chase conditions, and that's what you're kind of referring to on these fair chase rules is basically what they say. The hunter can't have an improper advantage over the game. It started out with airplanes. You couldn't spot game from the air. I mean, it develops as we go along, preserving the history of hunting. And that's the idea of this records program. It's an elite type of situation. It's the very best of the best, but we're not doing it to reward hunters. It's for game. So that's why we also have a minimum score. We don't just record the top 100 deer from every year and put them in a book. We say anything that's reached, for example, a typical whitetail, 160 inches or better, is a mature specimen that needs to be recognized in our data set, and in order to be part of this data set, you also should be hunting by fair chase. And so those are some of the rules. And I mean, you can go on our website and find the exact wording. You can't use electronic devices. There's no high fences, a deer trapped in snow, swimming, anything like that we've ever deemed, unsportsmanlike. That, is not the way that people should be pursuing animals. And so that's where this fair chase aspect of the records program came about.
Gotcha. Okay. Can you guys hold on 1 second? I've got to change batteries.
Okay. Boone and Crocket has to, every new technology comes out, it has to analyze if it degrades the hunt. What we've decided on trail cameras, it cannot be a camera that transmits images to the hunter. I can't be sitting at work watching the trail cameras on my 40 acres seeing if the deer are there. If it's a camera that you go out, you set it, you go pull the card, you bring it back home, you plug it in and look at what's on there, we feel that that's still okay. But the big hang up on the cameras is those that transmit images now, or any device that would alert you to the presence of an animal, instantaneously, basically, not return to the site to get a camera or something.
Right.
Yeah, we're getting to the point where the technology is available that's sending live feeds. And that's what Justin's referring to.
Right.
That's crossing the line.
So those are the cellular based game cameras that can send pictures to your phone or smartphones, or are there some that are out there that even like live feed web camera stuff now?
It wouldn't surprise me if there are, and it wouldn't surprise me if not. They'll be coming pretty shortly.
Gotcha.
But like Justin said, the majority of trail cameras out there and the majority of sportsmen that are using them are, finding out what's available on their property, trying to determine, what bucks, should be harvested this year, what bucks shouldn't be. when these deer are traveling, and they're going out and pulling the cards and studying them, and that's totally fine.
Okay, so that piece is okay. That's something I heard was not okay. So I'm glad we cleared that up tonight on the podcast, because there you hear these rumors, you never know if they're really true or not, and that's why we want to get you guys on the air. Dusty, what other myths have you heard about, or just rumors that you've heard about Boone and Crocket that you'd like to clear up tonight?
There's a lot of clarification on entries. Can you guys kind of run down of what entries qualify for the Boone and Crocket Club?
Okay, so for our records, we only recognize native North American big game. So you've got a few, small game animals. Wolves, for example, is not a big game animal in most areas, things like that. So, you're looking at the deer species, bears, basically just the big game that's common. Each category has a specific minimum. People get confused sometimes. We have awards minimums and all-time minimums. The all-time minimum is just used for one book we do every 6 years. The awards minimum is a Boone and Crocket qualifying trophy. And like I said earlier, we've set that level saying this is the top of the top. This is a mature specimen. Anything that meets this awards minimum, which is B&C minimum or higher, is recognized and goes into our data set. So, for example, whitetail cannot, you take a great buck, it needs to score 160 inches typically. You contact one of our official measures who've all been trained. It's a 4-day course. There's 1,320 of them, I believe, right now around North America. They're the ones that are going to talk to the hunter. They're going to have them fill out the information form, hunter guide and hunt form. I have a database that tells me how far people are taking game, what weapons they're using, weather conditions that happen. So we collect that, demographic type information, and they also make sure they explain to the hunter the rules of fair chase. The big ones for whitetail that we see, radio use. Some states allow it. You cannot guide a hunter to game by radio, but the OM is kind of the one that takes care of all this, in the field, and this is all on our website.
Right.
But once he scores that, then it's sent to me here in Missoula. I review every entry that comes in North America right now. And so I look at it and I make sure that all scoring procedures met. And the system was developed in 1950. Since that time, there's only been one major change, and that was a penalty where we, double penalize a deer if its spread was too wide. So this is basically the same thing we've been doing since the 50s, basically. And, every deer that comes along, there's clarifications, and this is where things come up. We've never seen a rack that has this exact situation here. Is this a freak trade? Is this something that shouldn't be rewarded? Or is this, a good healthy deer? Is this just a natural occurring thing? And that's where I think a lot of the misconceptions come from. Boone and Crocket's out to get people. No, we're looking for the normal. Bilateral symmetry is common throughout, all species. You look at anything. It left side matches the right side. There's our symmetry points. Mass is present when an animal has plenty of forage and everything. Mass is a sign of age. Mass is a sign of fitness.
Right.
So that's what they're designed on.
Right. All right. I'm gonna cut back a little bit. Say you're a hunter and you've harvested a mature Ohio slammer, a nice whitetail. What does a hunter do to get in contact with Boone and Crocket to get their buck scored?
You go to our website, and one of the menus is Big Game Records. Find an official measure, and you can put in your state, and it will list all official measures in your state with their contact information. There's a 60-day drying period that must take place. So, at day 58 or whatever, you get a hold of the measure and work out a time in a convenient location where the two you can meet and have it scored. And that's basically how the process is started.
Yeah.
And is that on? Go ahead.
There's no fee for that. Official measures are all volunteers. They do not charge to score. If your trophy does make it above the minimum, and we encourage everybody to enter their trophy, there is a $40 processing fee. But the official measure will take over from there. They have all the paperwork. They'll usher the hunter through the process and make sure that everything gets to Justin.
Awesome. Okay, I'm breaking that down a little bit. Is that a yearly book, or how long or often does your book come out for your records, and how long does your record stay in the book?
With the our records system is broken into 3-year periods.
Okay.
We're currently in the 29th awards period, and that's that awards minimum that I spoke about earlier.
Right.
Once your buck is entered, it will be in the records for eternity. Anytime I do an analysis, somebody calls and says, hey, is this state doing good? Is it doing bad? Whatever. I've always got those at my fingertips. Now, it'll only appear, if it's at the awards minimum, it'll appear in one book, in any species-specific book, but it's always a Boone and Crocket trophy, and it's always on the system. Every 6 years, we'll do an all-time book, which is the higher minimum score, and every single time we put out that book, as long as the trophy exceeds the all-time minimum, it's printed in that one book, but that's the only thing that other score is used for, so it's never dropped or anything. It's there. It just doesn't appear in every single book we put out going forward, because wildlife management's been so successful and we're seeing so many entries now.
Right. And I think that's something that's pretty commonly brought up, that, hey, I put my buck in your record books and it didn't come out in the publication, and I'm glad you mentioned all that, because it may clarify for somebody that don't have that information, that have submitted a buck through you guys, that, not every book gets your name printed in it.
Right.
I think that's one of the big, being me and Jay being in Jay and I being in the hunting industry and what we do, it's pretty common to hear talk, of, hey, I submitted a buck to Boone and Crocket and it's no longer in their record book when they print it out. And I'm glad you covered all that. Just to, maybe a listener that hasn't did the research and don't know all the details, then that's a good point. It's not always going to be there, but it's always on file with you guys.
And we do have an online trophy database that you can sign up for, and those list every trophy taken that's ever been, that currently exceeds the awards minimum of, any awards period. So you can always access those trophies on that website.
Tell us a little more detail. Tell us a little detail about how they can get online and register their buck.
What I'm saying is that you can go onto our website, and it's called Trophy Search, and you sign up. Currently, it's $50 a year, but basically it gives you 100% access to the same database that I work in, day in and day out. You can search by name, you can search by whatever. So if you've got a buddy that says, hey, I've got 15 bucks in Boone and Crocket, you can type in his name and see if they're really there. But you can, this would list everything. So say you want to check a particular county, any buck that's ever been registered and accepted for Boone and Crocket is going to show up on there, where it may not be in an awards book or an all-time book.
Right. That's some good information for a hunter to have for a county that he's either acquiring to hunt or he lives in that hunts, the county where he's at. That's some good information. Let me ask you this. How many trophy whitetails are in your record book?
Excuse me, I didn't hear you.
Give me how many record book whitetails do you guys have on record?
I actually just ran some numbers today, and with everything accepted and whatnot, we have 14,000 plus.
That's impressive.
And
a lot of deer.
That's typical and non-typical in there. So
right. That brings me to something. We're going to kind of branch out. I'm going to ask both of you. Memorable bucks. This is the Big Buck Registry, a Big Buck podcast. Let's get into, give us like top 3 most memorable bucks that's in the books.
Well, I can say for me, the ones that I've dealt with, the most memorable ones aren't necessarily ones in the book. They were scoring them for young hunters or, somebody that was a great buck. Truthfully, the wow deer, they're cool, but the stories, when you get to meet somebody and put a face to a hunt, and it's the biggest deer that they've ever seen in that state or something, but, may not rank nationally, those are the ones that stick out to me. The guy that was in the right place, right time, hunted his whole life, and, that one morning looked down out of the tree and there stands a 190-inch typical.
Yeah, that's a dream of mine, 190.
Well, there's always, the campfire fodder of great bucks, and I think you're referring to as well, legendary deer. And,
correct.
And some of those are, past world records, some are current world records, some are state records. It's really hard to put your finger on one. I think what Justin is saying is true. It's really the story behind those trophies, regardless of what they score.
Right. Do you have let's go with one. Can you tell us a quick story of one of your most memorable bucks that you was able to hear the story on?
Well, for me, it'd have to be the James Jordan buck, which was the world record typical up until 93. That's been surpassed by Milo Hansen's. This was a typical whitetail that was taken, long time ago. the guy's out hunting for meat, iron sight, single shot type rifle, comes across a big track, walks out the track, gets a shot at this deer, falls in the river, goes to get his buddy to help him get it out, comes back, the deer's gone, they search the river, they find it. He's meat hunting, not a big deal. This is in, middle of the country in Wisconsin. Decides to keep the rack for whatever reason, gives it to a taxidermist to mount for him. Years go by, taxidermist disappears, rack disappears, doesn't think anything of it. Some guy finds this rack in a garage sale. For years, this guy tried to connect himself with this rack, because it was eventually brought to Boone and Crockett's attention and scored and turned out to be the new world record typical whitetail. And there's a long saga of correspondence and him trying to say, hey, I don't care about the deer head. I don't want that, but I want recognition that I was the guy who shot this deer. And by the time all the due diligence was done and we had the evidence that proved that James Jordan was the hunter, it actually came within, 2 months after he had passed away.
Oh, man.
And
wow.
that deer was the world's record for several decades. And, many people consider that, the epitome of typical whitetail deer because it was just a massive 5x5 with no trash, just a clean big buck. And so
impressive.
To me, that's a story that sticks out. Because not only a tremendous deer, but the story behind it. And there's so many like that. We could spend hours going through that, not just on whitetail deer, but, many of the other species of big game that we track. Unbelievable stories. But I guess one important note to make here is, these aren't, this particular one is a story from the past, but we're seeing unbelievable trophies taken now. There is this misconception that, wow, these high-ranking trophies are all from, days gone by, the good old days. With very few exceptions, world records are being broken right now, and have been over the last 20 to 25 years.
Right. I'm going to add something to that there. You talk about there's a lot that to qualify you for Boone and Crocket. And if it's something that really that sparks your interest, do your research and find out how you qualify for you guys. The trail camera issue. That's something that if you're hunting a Boone and Crocket, you're trying to get in the books, just take the time and do the research. It's available.
Yeah, rumors are a dime a dozen. All this information that we're talking about and more is on our website under the Big Game Records tab. Policies, procedures, our fair chase statement, like Justin said, how to find official measure, the whole process, all the minimums, when the books are published. And you mentioned something that just occurred to me, and we've heard this before too, with folks saying, hey, I entered my deer, but I never saw it in the book. There are quite a few state record organizations that we support out there that maintain, whitetail records just for their state. And a lot of people think, well, hey, I entered my buck in Ohio Big Buck Club. And that means it's entered with Boone and Crocket. That's not true. That means you entered it with Ohio Big Buck. If we don't have the score chart and the entry, that means it never made it to us.
Right, and that's a good clarification, to get that out there.
Gotcha. So it's important to go to the website. The website is very extensive, by the way, and it has every single piece of information that you want. I've cruised it, and it's all there. One of the questions I had about all this, and it's kind of a question I think we need to answer, is that why score record animals at all?
Well, like I mentioned, this was started as a data set, and we are the only organization, only data set like it anywhere in the world where I have a comprehensive North American set of what trophies have done. There was recently some of our members pulled it up and looked to see, our trophies getting bigger, our trophies getting smaller. There's analyzation. So the reason we score it, and hunters need to remember this, it's cool to have your name in a book, but the reason you're scoring it's for conservation. You're putting your buck in so that we can analyze that and say, okay, here's this point. This is what the deer did. This is the antler it grew. We ask for age. I mean, that's why we do it, is for conservation. And that is probably the most lost concept in this whole process, is that this isn't about, your prowess as a hunter. This is about the animal, the management, and the steps we took to get here.
This whole thing is very much a conservation record, like Justin was explaining. In the early days, the records program was used to, track the recovery of game species as we brought them back from near extinction. We could track this progress. And now we've got, 100 plus years of this data set, and wildlife managers refer to this data in gauging the success or failure of their policies. You have a particular area that maybe our records historically show produced a fair amount of mature specimens that made the record book, and then over time that's fallen off. Now that's a red flag to these managers that says, hey, something's happened here on the ground. It could have been an environmental event. We might be releasing too many doe tags. We might have too liberal of a harvest. Maybe we need to adjust things. So when you have that Boone and Crocket animal and you're entering in the record book, you actually are contributing to the future management of that species in your state, in your county.
Gotcha. Can we go and say that if records are being broken, that it's a representation of a healthy herd of animals?
Broken records, I've been asked this commonly. It's almost to a point where some of our records is physically the maximum that an animal could ever grow. So a new broken record doesn't mean near as much. It's just overall entries. I mean, if an area is putting in a bunch of 160 and 170 typicals, that's a sign too. So don't think that just the world record would signify an improvement. That's actually almost to a point in many cases is a freak that doesn't really mean near as much as the overall number of these, lesser bucks, but still amazing Boone and Crocket specimens. Those are just as important as the number one for what we do.
Gotcha.
If you think about records as a conservation record and tracking conservation success, and you boil it down to the fact that if trophies are coming from a given area, given county, given state, given region, what have you, that represents that there has to be mature animals living there in order for them to grow large enough to be a trophy. And if you drill even deeper from a biological standpoint, mature animals on the landscape available for sportsmen mean that we're doing something right in terms of managing that herd properly. There's all kinds of evidence that shows, if there are no mature animals, then that herd is not in great health. It's not in great condition. Something has gone wrong, and typically it's either overharvest by natural predators or overharvest by hunters, or a combination of both. So it is a conservation record, and like Justin said, when we see a new world record broken, that's certainly a cause for celebration. That's a fantastic thing to see. That reaffirms the fact that these aren't just trophies of old. But overall, when we see volumes of entries coming from places, and especially new places, you've got, Kansas arrived on the scene here about 10 years ago as a trophy destination for whitetail. Kentucky is emerging right now as a new destination. Some of the eastern seaboard states that hardly ever had a Boone and Crocket entry, Maine, New Hampshire, Connecticut, they're producing mature animals. That's a testament to the sportsmen in that state and the state wildlife agencies in that state working together, doing something right.
Gotcha.
That's also a testament to Boone and Crocket for their record keeping. That not only do the state, the hunter, but Boone and Crocket needs to be recognized for your conservation that you guys are participating in by keeping the records.
Well, it all dovetails togeted. The records component of what we do and the conservation component of what we do are dovetailed, joined at the hip. And I think it's also important to point out that, we shouldn't lose perspective here that a Boone and Crocket trophy animal does not define the hunt. A trophy, any trophy taken in fair chase is a trophy. We shouldn't be teaching our young hunters that, if they go out and they don't shoot a Boone and Crocket animal, that they're a failure and that their hunt was a failure.
Right. Good point.
No, again, I'm going to pair what Keith said there. I mean, this is the biggest thing I see is people disappointed because they don't get a certain ranking or whatnot.
So you basically have the position that it's not that there's this anomaly out there that is determining whether or not the herd is healthy. It's more about the number of submissions that come in. The more the submissions, the healthier the herd, generally speaking, and that the conservation efforts are working in the manner in which it was designed to work. Is that accurate?
Correct, 100%.
Okay. As one of the things that I think is important, and you're not, Boone and Crocket is not the only club out there that scores record bucks, or animals. There are other groups, but it is important to you and to the health of conservation efforts in wildlife to make sure that your message gets out there so that you can continue to get these entries, so that, and it's not just that you get an entry, but that you get multiple entries to determine whether or not your efforts are working. Is that also an accurate statement?
Right. And very true. And you bring up, there are other methods out there, and we don't have any rules that say, you can't put it in any other book or any other recognition. That's fine. We just ask that if it does qualify for us, you include us, because, our motivation for this is conservation. And so that's our concern. And,
right.
Anything that just barely squeaks in is just as important as a new world record.
Right. And, being the director of marketing, it's important for your whole goal is to get the message out there so that you can keep an accurate tabs on the health of the population of animals throughout the country. What are your challenges when it comes to that?
Well, the challenges is just, any type of communications, ways to, reach a large enough audience that's interested in getting this message out there. A lot of things that we talked about, conservation record is actually the purpose for the records program and the reason why people should enter their trophy. I'm able to do that as an official measure when somebody brings a trophy to my house, and I get that opportunity to talk to them one-on-one, and I'm able to tell them this story, even if the guy came through the front door saying, well, I just want to know what he scores, I'm not interested in the record book. I hear that quite a bit. But just spending 5 minutes with them and explaining, you ought to enter this trophy, and here's why. Well, you can see the light bulbs just going off in these guys and gals. So my biggest challenge is duplication. How do I get this out to more people? And we've done, several types of things. We produce a television series for the Sportsman's Channel. We've done an entire episode on the history and relevance of records. We're putting more stuff in social media that talks about this, trying to get more of this information out to other websites, to forums, to bloggers. We'll eventually get there. Obviously, a radio program like this is a great platform. We certainly appreciate this opportunity.
Yep.
So it's not an insurmountable challenge. If you can think that Theodore Roosevelt and George Byrne Grinnell established conservation in this country without the internet, we can get this done now.
Good point. Very good point. I agree with that completely. Justin, as far as the records that are being kept, what challenges do you have on your side to make sure that these things are accurate? And what kind of do you ever find that you have a dispute that you have to overcome as to who is the owner of the record?
There's things like that come up, and it's very rare. I mean, 99% of what I deal with is it's a person's deer of a lifetime. They're so excited. It's not that big of a deal. I mean, there's a couple nasty stories about, a certain family member thought it should have been theirs, and their brother thought it should have been theirs, and huge court battles erupt over it. But that's the rarity. I mean, that's not my day-to-day at all. And again, my biggest challenge is just explaining to people, don't get worried about a number. Don't get worried about a ranking. Enjoy the fact that it was an amazing hunt. You killed a great deer. If it made Boone and Crocket great, it's the same idea. This is science. This isn't, you're not less of a hunter because your deer ranks 294 instead of 292.
Right. Gotcha. As far as the scores you keep the whitetails. That seems to be what comes to mind when I think of Boone and Crocket. It's the whitetail records and, the stories of the different world records and just, that type of stuff as far, like the Milo Hansen bucks and, anything like that. But as far as there are other animals that you score, mule deer, which I can see, elk, obviously sheep, moose, those are all, antlered or horned type animals, bears and cats. How do you score a bear or a cat?
It's skull measurements.
Okay.
Purely length and width of the skull. You cannot include the lower jaw. It has to be cleaned. It's one of the categories that it's very hard to field judge those things because some bears have fat heads and some bears have really big heads with not much fat on them. It's kind of one of those deals that a good mature bear, will have a bigger skull, but that's what we're looking for on those.
Gotcha. All right. Now you got to answer this question for me. When did walrus come into the record books?
I'm pretty sure it's an original category, and prior to the 70s, they were quite commonly hunted. Jaguar used to be fairly common, not common, I guess isn't the right term, but early on they were plentiful enough in Mexico where those were taken, and we still actually get a fair number of walrus entries because of, as I said, we recognize the animal, not the hunter, so we will take picked up heads into the records book, and there's a handful a year of people that fishermen or people that rent a float plane and fly the beach just to pick up trophy class walrus tusks.
Gotcha. That's amazing. I never realized that walrus was one of those ones that you actually keep. Now, as far as being able to access the records, do I have to be a member?
Excuse me. You need the trophy search that I mentioned earlier. The $50 is required. If you're an associate, we appreciate that support. That gives you a little bit of a discount, but the trophy search is what you need to have.
That's the online database.
Okay.
Prior to that being available, if you wanted to do your homework, or just peruse the records, it was only purchase the record book. But we've had this online searchable database for about 10 years now, and it's a wonderful research tool. You can literally ask it, rank by greatest spread, narrowest spread, most number of points, least number of points, rank by county, rank by, all locations. You can spend hours in there fiddling around. A lot of the trophy entries have field photos attached to them. We're constantly uploading more. But you're talking about a database spanning back to 1830. I think that's our oldest entry in the book. Wow.
And there's approximately 45,000 entries available on that database.
Okay. So there's a lot to go through, and not necessarily going to go through each one.
And you can set date ranges. A lot of guys are interested in what's transpired in the last 5 years and the last 10 years, so you don't have to look at the entire database. You can drill it down to just your county, the last 5 years, that type of thing. So,
with you guys viewing the records daily, pretty much, what direction is it heading? Is it looking promising?
Well, I would say overall, yes. And we, Justin mentioned that we publish record books every 3 years, and we do a little reset every 3 years and look at trending. I would say there are a couple categories that we're concerned about that we've been watching, caribou being one of them. Our caribou herds are in decline, woodland caribou, Quebec Labrador caribou. And when entire populations are in decline, naturally you're going to see that appear in records.
Right.
When these populations recover, that's reflected in the records as well. But for the most part, our sheep are in great shape, our deer are in great shape. Some folks believe we don't have quite the number of trophy class mule deer that we used to. There's some truth to that, yet we still see tremendous trophies every year. I think, if you ranked it in terms of total entries, whitetail's number 1. I think black bear is number 2. Pronghorn's number 3. Pronghorn has been slightly off lately, but, a lot of things kind of ebb and flow. Nothing is crashing, which is the good news.
Like Keith mentioned with those categories, it goes right along with percentage of North America that they inhabit. Obviously, whitetails take up they're found in more locations than anything else, so quite obviously we're going to have the largest sample of those.
Yeah, it's just good information to hear that, from somebody that sees it on a regular basis, just kind of general idea where their head's hurting. And that sounds like everything's doing pretty good, and there's areas you got to work on.
I can say that last year, the disease issues, my gut instinct, we haven't seen all the entries yet, but we're going to be down. You're going to see a lower year for whitetails. That being said, a couple years, smaller populations, there could be the potential for some amazing antler growth there.
Right.
There's year-to-year variations and there's overall trends. And Keith touched on the overall trends, but I do see year-to-year variations as well. And whitetails are fairly static relatively. They're not blowing up. They're not going down. They're kind of hanging on. Desert sheep are blowing up. Caribou are in the, tanking pretty much in many areas. So, each species is you could do a full show on each species basically.
Right. We understand that.
Gotcha.
Here's a couple of interesting trends that I've noticed. The number of Boone and Crocket trophies taken by young hunters and female hunters has been booming.
That's a good thing.
Really?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Absolutely. We started paying very close attention to, young hunters, kids that were boys and girls that were 16 years and younger when they harvest a Boone and Crocket trophy and have, acknowledged them in our records programs. That number's been steadily climbing since the last two awards periods. And same thing with, you're seeing the numbers nationally of the participation in hunting with women climbing. That's starting to show up in our record data as well.
Gotcha.
That's phenomenal.
So this bring up a great point, is that you're not just tracking the animal, you're tracking the people who harvested the animal.
That's part of the data set, you bet, and method of harvest.
Right.
Archery, compound bow, recurve bow, muzzleloader, handgun, shotgun, rifle. And then within that, we also are able to look at the data, shot distance, calibers used, type of equipment used. So there's trends there, that we can play with that data and see, more people are shooting 300 Win mags now when it used to be 30-06 and bullet and grain weights and all that kind of stuff. You can really slice and dice this data set a lot of different ways.
That's fascinating. Now, how much of that data is available to the club members versus what you guys get to see on a daily basis internally?
Well, I'm glad you brought that up. We're just in the process of completely rebuilding our database so that we can harvest more of that kind of data. It's there. We just haven't had a great system to harvest it, and we're doing a better job now so that, in the future, if somebody wants a report on, calibers used today and historically, or shot distances, or moon phases and weather conditions, we're going to be able to have greater access to that in the future than we do currently.
That's awesome. That's very cool. Justin and Keith, how do people reach you if they want to get a hold of you to talk about trophies or marketing?
Well, there's old school, pick up the phone.
Oh my God.
Yeah, there's always somebody here. There are email addresses on our website. That's usually an even better way to do it. That gives us, specific questions, a way to contact people, gives us a time frame to get back to people. We are a small staff here. We try and accommodate everybody in as timely a fashion as possible. So sometimes picking up the phone, you might not get immediate response, but an email will get responded to.
Our Facebook page is also very user-friendly as well. We've got a guy on there that you can have dialogue on there, and it'll come to the right person in the club as well. And commonly somebody's question, there's 10 other people out there with the exact same question, so we try to answer anything that comes in there as well.
Gotcha. So you've got a fairly active Facebook page and somebody that is dedicated to that page to answer questions.
Yep, absolutely.
Awesome. Very cool. Well, guys, this has been great. Thank you so much for spending some time with us to explain in a little more detail what Boone and Crocket is all about. It's something that's been around in my life for a long time. It's just, just a seed in my brain. But now now it's been explored. Now I understand it much better. And I'm glad we got to take the time to actually go through it. Now I'm sure all of our listeners are going to understand more about Boone and Crocket as well.
Well, certainly anybody that's traveling through Missoula, Montana, stop by our headquarters. We've got a gallery out front, a world record display, and Justin's here 24/7, 365 to answer all questions.
Beautiful.
Oh, and you'll just give out his cell phone number and we can text him, correct?
Yeah.
Beautiful.
You can call him.
Well, awesome, guys. But again, thanks again for joining us.
Thank you.
Man, I just learned a lot about Boone and Crocket that I did not know about.
I learned way more of a meaning to Boone and Crocket than trophy bucks. That's what, in my mind, for years before I became an adult male, I didn't know that much about it. But now I know a lot about it.
Right.
I knew more than I knew before. That's a fact.
I know a ton more. And I think it's such an important message to get out to our listeners and our community, because this is one of the founding fathers of the conservation efforts in the United States, period. And we would not have conservation or whitetails or any hunting in the United States as we know it today if these guys didn't form together back then to create a conservation effort. And that goes right on to the Pittman-Robertson Act, which we talked about with Jeff Markhamson down in Alabama earlier this year, and the Lacey Act, of course.
It's all tied together, and it's all for conservation. And I think from here on out, not only am I going to thank God for a nice whitetail, but I'm going to thank my grandpa, and I'm going to thank Boone and Crocket for what they've done for us.
Mm-hmm. And Teddy Roosevelt. It's crazy. It goes all the way back. And so, I think it is important to join these clubs. It's not that much money. It's really cool information, but those types of records being kept actually do mean something to conservation, because as we were talking to Justin, as we were talking to Keith, we learned that they don't really care about that one giant specimen. That may be the record book, and that's what everybody sees and hears about in the media, but that's actually not what they're looking for. They're looking to make sure that there are plenty of entries coming in for big deer, period, across the country, and to see which states are starting to come forward with some better records.
And it's a database for biologists too.
Exactly. It's a database for biologists, and it's about not just the deer, but the people that are harvesting the deer, whether you're male, female, young, old, what you harvested it with. All those things go into the decision making in the way that we hunt and what we can do and what we can't do. And these guys are a very influential piece of that.
Yeah, it boils down to if you're having trouble, you think you're not seeing a deer that you've seen before. Well, if you got 4 or 5 buddies that haven't submitted their bucks and they've killed trophies, just submit, have them get in touch with Boone and Crocket.
Yep.
Have them get the word out there that they've harvested a nice mature whitetail, and it may help in the long run. Not only for your state, but your county. They got to pinpoint it down where they can do some conservation in your area.
Exactly.
Right where you hunt, and that's important.
That's very important. And so if you've submitted a deer to the Big Buck Registry online on our Facebook page, or if you submitted a deer to Chubby Tines Outdoors, and you've got a deer that's pretty significant, 160 or better, it's probably worth your while to submit it to the Boone and Crocket Club. You don't have to be a member, from what I understand. After talking to those guys, you can just...
And it's free. Just for the scoring. Yeah.
Right. They're just interested in the conservation biology side of things. And you can get it scored and potentially enter those record books. So you should definitely do that. So if you got a big buck and you've submitted to Chubby Tines or Big Buck Registry, definitely consider sending it into Boone and Crocket as well.
Well, Jay, that about wraps us up for tonight, and I look forward to getting on the Big Buck Registry, Big Buck Podcast next week. Thanks for tuning in. Jay, how can they reach you at the Big Buck Registry?
All right, I'm going to run down all our contact information. You can give us a call at 724-613-2825. Give us some feedback about the show or a big hunt that you've been on. You can text us pictures there as well. Just make sure that if you're sending in a big buck or a buck that you just want to have posted on our websites, or potentially have a story done on it through our podcast, just make sure you include at least the first name of the hunter, the state in which it was harvested, and whether or not it was a special situation like a first buck or something like that. And we'll post it up there if it meets our qualifications. And I don't post all of them, but most get on. If you want to visit our website, it's www.bigbuckregistry.com. You'll see and be able to listen to and see all our blog posts there about the stories we share on the Big Buck podcast in more detail than what you hear here. You'll be able to listen, but also read about it. You can find us on Facebook at facebook.com/BigBuckRegistry and twitter.com/BigBuckRegistry. And we are on all kinds of podcast directories if you want to listen to the show. We're on iTunes, Blueberry, Stitcher, TuneIn Radio, and Libsyn. Dusty, I think that's a wrap, man.
Awesome.
I'm Jay Scott.
And I'm Dusty Phillips.
This is the Big Buck Registry's Big Buck Podcast. See you next week.
Can't wait.